The sun over the vast plains of Texas burned like a brand against the backs of cattle and men alike. Dust devils danced between dry tufts of prairie grass, and the smell of sun-baked earth mixed with the faint iron scent of old blood. It was here, on the outskirts of a town that barely deserved a name, Willow Creek, that Jeremiah Boone's ranch stood, a scattering of low, weather-beaten buildings surrounded by sagging fences and a few scrawny oaks fighting for life in the unyielding soil. Jeremiah had lived here alone for years, ever since burying his wife under the only shade tree that would hold her grave. Folks in town called him the Ghost Rancher, half because he kept to himself, half because he looked like a man who'd already lost more than he could carry. If you asked around, they'd tell you Boone was once the best cattleman for miles, honest, but stubborn to a fault. Some folks said the land itself had turned against him when grief hollowed him out. That morning, he'd ridden into town with a single silver dollar tucked deep in his vest pocket, hoping only to trade for spare parts for his windmill pump. Instead, he found himself in the middle of a scene that made the bile rise in his throat. A ragged mule cart parked in the square. A man with rotting teeth dangling a rope like a leash around a girl's wrists. Her skin was cracked from the sun, eyes swollen from crying too long. The trader barked prices at the passers-by as if he were hawking sides of beef. It was the way the men laughed that broke something inside Jeremiah. He'd heard that same laughter once before in the trenches outside Vicksburg when another man's pain was someone else's entertainment. He'd sworn back then he'd never be that kind of man. So he paid, and when he brought her to his horse, he felt every eye in the square on his back, eyes that said he'd made himself a target, a fool, or both. That afternoon, the laughter started before he even crossed the saloon doors. He heard it echo from the hitching post, where a group of local ranch hands and small-time cattle barons gathered to drink away the sweat and grit of another blistering day. They spoke loud enough for him to hear, mocking the rumor that had spread like wildfire since sunrise, that Jeremiah Boone had paid good money, real money, to free a slave girl no one else would lift a finger for. Inside, the saloon smelled of stale whiskey and sawdust. The piano player paused when Jeremiah entered, his boots leaving dusty prints across the warped wooden floor. He stood out, taller than most, beard peppered gray, hat shadowing a face hardened by years of sun and loss. At the far end of the bar, Ethan Rourke leaned back in his chair, boots up, spurs jingling softly. He was the biggest cattleman in 3 counties, a man who prided himself on keeping order the way he saw fit. His boys flanked him like mangy dogs waiting for a scrap. The grin on Ethan's face spread wide when he saw Jeremiah. "Well, if it ain't Boone the hero," Ethan drawled. "Come to buy a round for the whole room, seeing as you've got coin to waste on a darky girl?" Jeremiah ignored the laugh that followed. He set his gloves down on the bar and nodded to Martha, the barkeep's wife, who poured him a glass without asking. "Got no quarrel with you today, Rourke," Jeremiah said, voice low but clear. "Not here for trouble." "Trouble?" Ethan's grin widened. "Boy, you just bought yourself a lifetime of it. You think you're some saint? You freed her. So what? That girl's gonna bring your ranch down around your ears. Ain't no place for her out here. She was property. And you know what happens when you mess with another man's property." A hush settled in the room, not out of respect for Jeremiah, but because everyone wanted to see which fool would swing first. A man coughed in the corner, spitting tobacco into a tin cup. The piano man packed up his tune. A breeze drifted through the open door, carrying the dry scent of sagebrush and the faint sound of distant cattle lowing. Jeremiah turned, glass in hand, meeting Ethan's eyes with a calm that made the room colder than the desert night. "I ain't gonna let a child be sold like livestock. Not while I've still got breath." Ethan leaned forward, boots thudding to the floor. "You just remember, Boone, this land don't take kindly to a man who forgets where his place is. And that girl, she run or she get you killed." Jeremiah downed his whiskey in one swallow and placed the glass gently on the counter. For a heartbeat, he wondered if he'd feel fear. He didn't, only an old ache in his ribs, the ghost of a bullet from his days as a Confederate scout. He'd survived men meaner than Rourke. But now it wasn't just his own skin he had to think of. Back at the ranch, dusk painted the horizon with a bruise of purple and red. The ranch felt smaller now, shadows pooling between the boards of the corral and the old wagon half swallowed by weeds. In the small bunkhouse beside the main cabin, Lila sat on a rough blanket near the hearth. She couldn't have been older than 16. Her wrists bore fading rope burns. Her hair was a tangled halo that caught the glow of the dying fire. She jumped at every creak of the floorboards, her thin shoulders hunched as if to brace for a blow that no longer came. She'd barely spoken since they arrived. When Jeremiah brought her a tin cup of warm milk, she held it like something precious and fragile, eyes downcast. "You got a name?" he asked again, softer now that the world outside was hushed. The girl's voice cracked like dry brush. "Lila," he nodded. "You got kin?" She shook her head. "Sold, long ago. Don't know where." He noticed her eyes linger on the door, as if she had expected someone to drag her back into the dirt. He thought of his wife, Margaret, the way she'd used to hum while sewing under that same roof. She'd always said the world would break a man who didn't stand for something. "You ain't got to worry about Rourke and his men tonight. I'll sleep here by the door. No one's taking you nowhere, Leila. Not while I draw breath." She looked at him, and for the first time, he thought he saw a question behind her fear, as if she couldn't quite believe anyone would stand between her and the darkness outside. Later that night, Jeremiah sat by the bunkhouse door, rifle across his knees, boots planted in the dust. Coyotes yipped at the edge of the prairie, their cries echoing over the empty fields. Somewhere beyond the fence, a lone steer bawled, the sound swallowed by the wind. He scanned the shadows, every creak of the ranch wood making his shoulders tense. In town, he knew, the whispers were growing teeth. Men like Rourke didn't threaten. They promised. The next time he'd see them, it wouldn't be inside a saloon where polite eyes and the sheriff's badge kept bullets holstered. It would be out here where the grass met the horizon and a man's screams could be buried under miles of open sky. Still, as the cold crept into his bones, Jeremiah felt something that surprised him, a flicker of purpose. Years of living alone had stripped the meaning from his days, made his nights heavy with ghosts. Now there was someone small and trembling under his roof who needed him to stand tall. He closed his eyes for a moment, listening to the wind whistle through the gaps in the bunkhouse walls. He thought of his wife's grave under that old oak, the only patch of green for miles. He'd promised her he'd be a better man than his father. Maybe this was what that promise looked like, all these years later. At dawn, he would ride to town for supplies, flour, salt, fresh bullets. He'd need to fix the fence, mend the roof, teach Lila how to care for the chickens. There was work to do. And trouble would come. But for the first time in too long, Jeremiah Boone knew exactly what he was fighting for. He tightened his grip on the rifle and watched the darkness for the first sign of headlights or torches, and dared any man to cross the threshold of the Boone Ranch without meeting the barrel of his gun. The next morning dawned sharp and dry, the sky so blue it looked brittle enough to crack. Jeremiah hadn't slept more than an hour in the hard chair by the bunkhouse door, but he stood, boots crunching over the frost-bitten dirt, ready for whatever fool might come riding through his gates. The rooster's crow barely carried past the half-rotten fence posts. In the makeshift coop behind the barn, a handful of scrawny hens scratched at the bare earth. Jeremiah squatted down beside them, feeling the ache in his knees, and scattered feed with a gloved hand. He knew it wasn't enough. Nothing on this ranch had been enough in years. Inside the bunkhouse, Lila stirred at the faint rattle of the feed bucket. She watched him through the half-open door, eyes narrowed against the bright morning light. She hadn't asked for breakfast, hadn't asked for anything, really. She just sat there, knees hugged to her chest, as if bracing for the moment she'd be dragged away again. "Eggs," Jeremiah said, setting a dented tin plate on the table near her bedroll. They ain't much, but they're yours." She looked at the plate, then at him. Her hands twitched once, as if wanting to reach but not quite trusting the invitation. Jeremiah tried not to stare too long. He knew how men's eyes had taught her to flinch. "You stay here," he said. "I'll ride to town for what we need. Lock the door behind me. Don't open it lest you hear my voice." In town, the air was heavy with a tension thicker than the dust on the main road. When Jeremiah tied his horse outside the general store, he could feel every eye on his back, from the blacksmith who paused mid-swing, to the housewives gossiping over bolts of calico on a store porch. They didn't bother to lower their voices anymore. "Should have let her be," hissed one older woman as she wrapped sugar in brown paper. "Ain't no good bringing that kind up here." "Might bring trouble to all of us," said another, her husband nodding behind her, hat clutched to his chest like a shield. Inside the store, Thomas Pritchard, the storekeep, pretended to dust a barrel of flour. His eyes darted to the sack Jeremiah dropped on the counter. Salt, dried beans, candles, .44 cartridges. "You planning on a siege, Boone?" Pritchard asked, voice too loud for the small room. Jeremiah didn't look up. "Just planning on staying alive." Pritchard cleared his throat. "Word is, Rourke's men are riled up. They say you stole what was rightfully traded. They say, I paid," Jeremiah cut in, slow and deliberate. "Ain't no man alive that can call that theft." A small crowd gathered behind him, boots shuffling on the warped floorboards. He could hear the whispers, the shifting weight of men trying to decide whose side they were on. In a place like Willow Creek, loyalty was worth about as much as a bucket of spit. Pritchard lowered his voice, leaning in. "I heard Rourke sent for Judge Halbert. Claims you interfered in a lawful trade. They might come for you with papers, not just guns." Jeremiah's eyes hardened. "Then let him bring papers. But they best bring coffins, too." Back at the ranch, Lila sat near the window, watching the dirt road through a crack in the shutter. Every creak of the floor, every gust of wind that rattled the loose boards made her pulse race. She traced the fading welts on her wrists with her thumb, remembering the trader's rough hands, the filthy rope that burned like fire. She didn't understand this man, this Jeremiah Boone. Why spend good silver on her? Why bring her here just to risk everything? She knew enough about white men to know there was always a price. She wondered when he'd tell her what she owed. She stood, pacing the cramped bunkhouse, eyes flitting to the old rifle propped by the door. Once she pressed her ear to the wood, half expecting to hear a mob forming outside, the same way they had at the last place. A girl like her didn't last long when men decided they wanted her gone. When Jeremiah returned near dusk, he found her curled in the corner, clutching a threadbare blanket around her shoulders. He set the supplies down with a soft thud and knelt beside her. "I got salt pork, biscuits too, and bullets." He tried to make his voice calm, but it came out like gravel. She lifted her eyes, hollow and sharp all at once. "Why you do this?" Jeremiah exhaled, the question heavier than any sack he'd hauled from the store. "Because no one else did. Because I got enough ghosts on my conscience." She flinched at that word, ghosts. To her, they weren't just memories. They were the faces of every kind man who turned cruel when the door shut. She didn't want to believe him, but she wanted to hope. And hope was a dangerous thing. That night, the wind blew colder than it had in weeks. Jeremiah stood at the edge of his fence line, rifle slung low, eyes scanning the moonlit prairie. His breath fogged in the brittle air. In the distance, coyotes yipped, but beyond that, he heard something worse. Silence. The kind that wrapped around a man's throat before the noose ever found it. He saw a lone rider on the ridge, just a silhouette, backlit by the ghostly glow of the moon before turning and disappearing behind the rocks. A scout, maybe, or just a message. "We see you, Boone, and we're coming." Inside the bunkhouse, Lila slept fitfully, the blanket clutched under her chin. She dreamed of chains that clinked like wind chimes, of voices that told her she was worth nothing but pain. Jeremiah watched her through the cracked door. He felt the familiar ache in his chest, the guilt that maybe he'd done her no favor, that all he'd done was paint a target on her back. But deep in his gut, something told him the fight was worth it. A man didn't measure himself by the cattle he owned or the acres he fenced, but by who he stood for when the world turned mean. As dawn crept closer, Jeremiah's eyes stayed wide open. He knew the rope was tightening around his neck, but he'd let them pull all they wanted. If they wanted his ranch, they'd find him standing at the gate, Winchester in hand, and they'd have to walk over his grave and hers to take it. The third morning dawned under a sickly yellow sky, the kind that promised a dry thunderstorm and trouble in equal measure. Jeremiah Boone woke to the faint echo of hooves in the distance, too many hooves for a single rider. He lay still on his bedroll in the bunkhouse, boots still on, rifle across his chest like a lover's arm. Lila was already awake, curled in the far corner. Her eyes darted to him every time the wind rattled the shutters. She'd barely spoken since the question she asked him 2 nights before, "Why you do this?" Now she watched the man who'd bought her freedom pace the dusty yard like a caged wolf. The first shot came at dawn, a single crack that splintered the hush of the prairie. Jeremiah was feeding the horses when a bullet whined past his shoulder and buried itself in the fence post behind him. He ducked, rolled, and came up with his Winchester pressed to his cheek. "Lila, down," he barked, heart pounding in his ears. From the edge of the old cattle trail, he spotted them, 2 shapes on horseback, dark against the rising sun. Rourke's men. Paid guns with more liquor than brains. They shouted insults Jeremiah couldn't quite make out, then spurred their horses in a slow circle, taunting him to fire first. He didn't. He held his aim steady, breathing like he did years ago on the battlefield, waiting for the moment when a man's hate overcame his sense. It came quick. One rider lifted his pistol high, whooped, and leveled it straight at the bunkhouse window. Jeremiah squeezed the trigger. The Winchester roared once. The rider toppled sideways, boot caught in the stirrup, body dragging along the hard-packed earth as the horse bolted. The second man fled without looking back. After the gunfire died, silence settled like a shroud. The only sound was the creak of the windmill turning overhead. Jeremiah lowered the rifle and wiped the sweat from his brow with a trembling hand. Inside, Lila crouched behind the bunkhouse table, arms wrapped over her head. When she realized it was over, she lifted her gaze to him, and for the first time there was something other than fear in her eyes. It was something closer to trust. "You shoot them?" she asked, her voice rasping. "One's gone," Jeremiah muttered, reloading. "One'll carry word back to Rourke. They know now I won't lay down and die easy." Later that day, the sheriff came. Sheriff Clay Hanlon was a thin man who wore his badge like an apology. He rode up with his hat in his hands, eyes downcast, dust covering his boots and the hem of his duster. He looked like he'd rather be anywhere but here. "Boone," he said, voice low, "we gotta talk." Jeremiah stood on the porch of the bunkhouse, hands resting on the railing. Lila peered through the cracked door behind him, just out of sight. "Talk, then." Hanlon cleared his throat, glancing back at the lone deputy who lingered by the fence. "Ethan Rourke's filed papers in Austin. Claims you stole a girl that was legally traded. Says you're harboring a fugitive." "She's a human being," Jeremiah snapped. "Not a goddamn cow to brand." "I know that, Boone. You think I don't know that? But Rourke's got half the town behind him. Men are scared. Scared you'll bring federal eyes here. Scared there'll be trouble." "There's already trouble," Jeremiah said, jerking his chin toward the bloodstain by the fence line, "and I didn't start it." Hanlon looked past him, eyes catching Lila's dark silhouette. "I'm asking you, friend to friend, let her go. Send her north. Let this blow over." Jeremiah's laugh was dry and hollow. "Send her where? To who? You know what happens to a girl like her out there alone." Hanlon shook his head, jaw working. "I can't protect you if this turns bad, Boone. Rourke's got men coming in from Pecos. Hired guns, mean ones. Jeremiah leaned forward, voice low. Then they'll get a mean welcome. Now get off my land, Sheriff, unless you plan on helping me dig new graves. Hamlin's shoulders sagged. He touched the brim of his hat, then turned and mounted up. As he rode away, the dust settled slowly, and the knot in Jeremiah's gut twisted tighter. That night, a storm brewed on the horizon, low thunder rolling across the plains, heat lightning flickering like a false dawn. Lila sat by the hearth, carefully peeling potatoes Jeremiah had traded for last spring. Her hands were steadier now, though they still flinched at sudden sounds. "You ever shoot a gun?" Jeremiah asked, voice rough from a long day fixing fence posts and oiling every rifle he owned. Lila looked up, startled. "No, sir." He grunted. "Might be time you learned. Rourke won't stop till he's sure you're gone or dead." She set the knife down, voice trembling. "I don't want to die." Jeremiah met her eyes, seeing something fierce beginning to spark there. The same fire he'd seen in young soldiers once, boys who turned into men when the first shot rang out. "Ain't no one here dying tonight, not if I can help it." Hours later, the wind howled through the dry creek beds like a chorus of ghosts. Lila lay curled on her pallet in the corner, the old blanket tucked under her chin. She couldn't sleep. Every roll of thunder sounded like a gunshot. In her mind, she replayed the way Jeremiah had stood between her and that bullet, the way his eyes never wavered. She thought of the men who'd owned her before, men who looked through her like empty space, who saw her as a commodity to trade, break, or bury. But this man? He looked at her like she mattered, like her being alive meant something worth fighting for. Just before dawn, the first sign of what was to come appeared on the far edge of the prairie. A distant flicker, torches maybe, or lanterns bobbing slowly along the ridge. But alongside that glow, Jeremiah noticed something else, the glint of metal. Not pistols, but polished buttons on bluecoats, Union blue. He couldn't be sure yet, but somewhere deep in his bones he felt it. The storm Rourke was bringing wasn't the only one brewing. And maybe, just maybe, the fight he'd started wouldn't end with him and the girl lying cold in the dirt. As the first fat drops of rain splattered on the parched earth, Jeremiah Boone stood watch with his rifle resting on the porch rail, ready to greet the dawn with a barrel of hot iron and the promise of blood if it came to that. By dawn, the rain had turned the dry earth around the Boone ranch into a muddy mess of hoofprints and wagon ruts. The prairie grass, beaten flat by the storm, shivered under the pale sun. Jeremiah Boone stood at the fence line, boots half sunk in the wet clay, Winchester balanced across his arms like a promise he fully intended to keep. Across the ridge, Rourke's men waited in a ragged line, horses restless, the men's shoulders hunched against the wind that carried the sharp scent of wet sage. Beside them, the blue uniforms of the Union soldiers gleamed like a row of iron statues. Their presence looked impossible out here, as if the law had finally remembered this patch of forgotten land. At their head, the captain sat ramrod straight in the saddle. His scarred face was impassive, eyes hidden under the brim of his hat, but the weight of his authority radiated down the slope like the chill before thunder. Rourke's voice cut through the hush, harsh as a bullwhip. "Boone, you think these boys in blue are going to guard your doorstep forever? Law's one thing, men like me were another." Jeremiah shifted his rifle. The wood was warm where his hands had held it through the long hours of waiting. He felt Lila's presence behind him on the porch. He didn't have to turn to know she was there, eyes wide but steady. "I didn't ask him to come," Jeremiah called back, his voice echoing across the cold prairie. "But they're here just the same. Maybe folks will remember there's more to law than a piece of paper signed by crooks like you." The captain spoke then, his tone so calm it made Rourke's bluster sound like the yapping of a cornered dog. "This land is under federal jurisdiction now. That girl is free by law and under my protection until this matter is settled in Austin." Rourke spat into the mud, the phlegm mixing with the rainwater pooling in the wagon ruts. "She's worth good money." "And you," he sneered at Boone, "you just threw away your whole damn life for nothing." Jeremiah barked a laugh that came out rough from too many years buried in silence. "Maybe I did. But you won't get her back. Not today." Behind him, Lila stepped down from the porch. The boards creaked under her bare feet. She refused the old boots Jeremiah had offered. She wanted to feel the earth, the wet clay squelching under her solace. It made her real, made this freedom real. She stared at Rourke across the fence line, her chin lifted, hair damp and curling around her face. She didn't flinch when his eyes raked over her like he still owned her. And when she spoke, her words carried farther than the captain's badge or Jeremiah's rifle ever could. "You ain't got chains big enough to drag me back now," she said, voice steady, clear. "If you come for me, you best bring your own coffin." A ripple of surprise moved through Rourke's men. A few of them shifted in their saddles, eyes darting away from hers. In town, they'd whispered that she was weak, a ghost of a girl. But here she was, spitting defiance like a flame in the wind. Rourke's lip curled around a curse. His hand hovered near his revolver, but the captain's men shifted too. Rifles angled, the sharp glint of bayonets catching the rising sun. Tension crackled through the cold morning air. One heartbeat, two. Then Rourke's nerve cracked. He jerked his reins, spurred his horse around so violently that mud sprayed across the fence boards. "This ain't over, Boone," he snarled over his shoulder. "You'll starve on that dirt patch. And when they leave, I'll be back." The captain watched him ride off, the retreating shape of power crumbling in the prairie haze. Rourke's men followed, some glancing back at Boone's gate with the wary look of men who just realized their leader wasn't half as big as he'd claimed to be. In Willow Creek, the word spread before the dust even settled. Martha, behind the bar, wiped the same glass over and over, the rag trembling in her hands. The blacksmith leaned on his hammer, staring at the road like he expected to see Rourke come storming back. But he didn't. Some folks felt relief. Others felt fear. A few, shamed by their silence, wondered if maybe they'd stood on the wrong side of the fence too long. At the Boone Ranch, the soldiers set up their temporary camp. Bedrolls and tin coffee cups, steam curling into the cold air. The smell of wet leather and fresh brewed grounds replacing the stink of fear that had clung to the place for days. The captain stood with Jeremiah near the fence line. Between them, Lila held a tin mug, warming her hands. She still didn't smile wide, she didn't know how yet, but her eyes were bright, clear of the shadows that had clouded them when Jeremiah first bought her life back. "You did more than free her, Boone," the captain said, tapping the ash from his pipe. "You reminded this land what it means to stand for something. That's worth a hell of a lot more than cattle." Jeremiah watched Lila trace the fence rail with her fingertips. Beyond her, the field still lay ragged, half-starved from drought and neglect. But now they looked different to him. Not just broken earth, but soil that could hold roots if tended right. He let out a slow breath. Maybe now they'll see she's worth more than they ever were. That night, as the soldiers' campfires flickered like a string of stars across his pasture, Jeremiah sat with Lila on the porch steps. She leaned against his shoulder, and for the first time, she didn't flinch at the closeness. She felt solid beside him, not something to be hidden or caged, but someone. "You ever been to a real town?" he asked her, voice low under the hush of crickets. She shook her head. "No, only ever saw wagons, fields." He smiled, the memory of his wife's voice drifting back through the years. "One step at a time, Jeremiah. One step and you'll find the road carries you farther than you dreamed. Maybe we'll fix the corral, get some good stock again. And when you're ready, you can ride into town on your own 2 feet. Nobody'll say what you are ever again." Lila looked up at him, her eyes shimmering with the reflection of the campfires. In the distance, the Union flag fluttered above the captain's tent, a sign that, for now, no man's claim of ownership would chain her again. At dawn, the windmill squealed on its rusted bearings, creaking like a tired old song. But this time, It didn't sound like a ghost's wail. It sounded like a promise. Jeremiah Boone, the rancher they mocked for freeing a slave girl, stood in the muddy yard with his rifle propped against his shoulder, watching the sun crawl across a land that still bore his name. Soldiers stood guard at his gate, but it wasn't just them. It was the idea they carried, that even out here at the far edge of the map, a single man's choice could echo farther than any fence line. And beside him, the girl they said wasn't worth saving stepped forward to meet the dawn with her head held high.